At Paris, Slidell was even more hopeful than Mason. He had won over Emil Erlanger, the great banker who was deep in the confidence of Napoleon. So cordial became the relations between the two that it involved their families and led at last to the marriage of Erlanger's son with Slidell's daughter. Whether owing to Slidell's eloquence, or from secret knowledge of the emperor's designs, or from his own audacity, Erlanger, toward the close of 1862, made a proposal that is one of the most daring schemes of financial plunging yet recorded. If the Confederate government would issue to him bonds secured by cotton, Erlanger would underwrite the bonds, put the proceeds of the sale to the credit of the Confederate agents, and wait for the cotton until it could run the blockade or until peace should be declared. The Confederate government, after some hesitation, accepted his plan and issued 15 millions of Erlanger bonds, bearing 7%, and put them on sale at Paris, London, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt. As a purchaser of these bonds, it was to be given cotton eventually at a valuation of 6 pence a pound, and as cotton was then selling in England for nearly 2 shillings, the bold gamble caught the fancy of speculators. There was a rush to take up the bonds and to pay the first installment. But before the second installment became due, a mysterious change in the market took place and the price of the bonds fell. Holders became alarmed, and some even proposed to forfeit their bonds rather than pay on May 1st, 1863, the next installment of 15% of the purchase money. Thereupon Mason undertook to bull the market. Agents of the United States government were supposed to be at the bottom of the drop in the bonds. To defeat their schemes, the Confederate agents bought back large amounts in bonds intending to resell. The result was the expenditure of some $6 million with practically no effect on the market. These Erlanger bonds sold slowly through 1863 and even 1864 and netted a considerable amount to the foreign agents of the Confederacy. The comparative failure of the Erlanger loan marks the downfall of King Cotton. During the latter part of the war, the government secured the meager funds at its disposal abroad by rushing cotton in swift ships through the blockade. So important did this traffic become that the Confederacy passed stringent laws to keep the control in its own hands. One more cause of friction between the Confederate and the state authorities was thus developed. The Confederate navigation laws prevented the states from running the blockade on their own account. The effects of the blockade were felt at the ends of the earth. India became the exporter of cotton. Egypt also entered the competition. Egypt, briefly an exotic nation of cotton, neither Eastern nor Western, found one of his opportunities in the American War and the failure of the cotton supply. A popular revulsion of feeling preceded and followed the great period of Confederate history. These 6 months of titanic effort, which embraced between March and September 1862, splendid success along with catastrophe. But there was a marked difference between the two tides of popular emotion. The wave of alarm which swept over the South after the surrender of Fort Donelson was quickly translated into such a high passion for battle that the march of events until the day of Antietam resounded like an epic. The failure of the triple offensive which closed this period was followed in very many minds by the appearance of a new temper, often as valiant as the old, but far more grim and deeply seamed with distrust. And how is this distrust, of which the Confederate administration was the object, to be accounted for? Various answers to this question were made at the time. The laws of the spring of 1862 were attacked as unconstitutional. Davis was held responsible for them, and also for the slow equipment of the Army. Because the Confederate Congress conducted much of its business in secret session, the President was charged with a love of mystery and an unwillingness to take the people into his confidence. Arrests under the law suspending the writ of habeas corpus were made the text for haranguers' liberty. The right of freedom of speech was dragged in with General Van Dorn in the Southwest, threatened with suppression of any newspaper that published anything which might impair confidence in a commanding officer. How could he have dared to do this, was the cry, unless the President was behind him? And when General Bragg assumed a similar attitude toward the press, the same cry was raised. Throughout the summer of victories, even while the thrilling stories of Seven Pines, the Peninsula, Second Manassas were sounding like trumpets, the muttering of discontent formed an ominous accomplishment. Yancey, speaking of the disturbed temper of the time, attributed it to the general lack of information on the part of Southern people as to what the Confederate government was doing. His proposed remedy was an end of the censorship which that government was attempting to maintain, and the secret session of its Congress, and the taking of the people into full confidence. Now a senator from Alabama, he attempted at the opening of the congressional session in the autumn of 1862 to abolish secret sessions, but in his effort he was not successful. There seems little doubt that the Confederate government had blundered in being too secretive. Even from Congress, much information was withheld. A curious incident has preserved what appeared to the military mind the justification of the reticence of the time. The Secretary of War refused to comply with a request for information, holding that he could not do so without disclosing the strength of our armies to many persons of subordinate position whose secrecy cannot be relied upon. "I beg leave to remind you," said he, "of a report made in response to a similar one from the Federal Congress, communicated to them in secret session, and now a part of our archives."